Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really glad that you're here. Thanks for taking the time at the end of sure what was a busy day to think seriously about classroom management, not just as a set of strategies, but as something that shapes who students become. Can someone out there just sort of in the chat just say hello or that you can hear me? I don't want to be sitting here talking to myself. That would be great. While I'm waiting for that, I called this session, thank you all. I called this session Classroom Management for a Democratic Society because classrooms aren't just places where content gets delivered. They're places where students learn every day how authority works, how conflict gets handled, and whether their voice matters. In other words, classroom management isn't something separate from our values, it's how our values show up. Especially right now, when disagreement is so often turns into certainty or shutdown, how we handle disagreement in classrooms really matters. What we teach students about handling disagreement matters. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we get started, I want to get a sense of who is in the room. So I'm going to launch a poll. Just a quick poll to let me know what are the roles that you play at your job. Great, thank you. That is very helpful. We have a good mix of people, teachers of all levels, coaches, mentors, and some social workers. Thank you all for being here. If you don't know me, my name is Tim Fredrick. I am a former high school English teacher, a curriculum designer, sorry, someone who spent a lot of time helping educators think about creating a classroom culture of belonging, especially what happens in the moments when things aren't going smoothly. Pedagogy Guru is where I bring that work together. It's a professional learning space focused on reflection, small shifts in practice, and building classrooms that are more connected and sustainable for students and teachers. I'll share more about Pedagogy Guru later in the session. Let's take a quick look at our agenda for the next hour. We'll first talk about what classroom management actually teaches students and how we can shift your language to make your classroom more democratic. We'll also go over the ABC conflict resolution process. I've gotten a lot of great feedback on how helpful this process is. Lastly, I've saved time for questions and answers. But first, a little bit of business. If you have any questions you would like me to answer, please use the Q&A tool. I believe it should be at the bottom in the black bar at the bottom. I've definitely have saved time at the end to answer any questions you have. I've also created a web page that contains the resources from today's webinar, including these slides, plus an evaluation for after. I'm going to share that in the chat for you. All right, if you go there, oops, you'll see this web page. This first link right here is the link to the Mentimeter that we will be using. So if you click on that, that'll bring that right up. I also will have instructions later on how you can access it. The second link here is the evaluation. That's for later. And then here's a bunch of resources that I've included, some writing that I've done on our Substack around this idea of classrooms being democratic spaces. And lastly, some links to some of the classes we have at Pedagogy Guru, plus ways for us to stay in touch. So keep that open because you will need the link to the Mentimeter a little bit later. And I'm going to send out, probably not tomorrow, but maybe later this week or beginning next week, an email that we're going to have a link to that webpage just in case you lose it. And I will put the video for this webinar on there as well. So you'll have all the resources you need in one place. So let's try the Mentimeter. Let's open it up. If you don't have it open, you can also do the following. I'm going to put a link and a code in the chat. You can click on that link and you'll see there's a place to put that code at the very top of that page. But what I want to talk about, when you click on there, you're going to see a question that is, what skills do we need to successfully participate in a democracy? And feel free to put in multiple answers because we definitely need more than one for sure. So if you can get started with that, let me switch over. Oh, sorry. hadn't started the presentation. Now you should be able to do it if you haven't been able to do it before. So again, you're just going to that link and answering what skills do we need to successfully participate in a democracy? Self-awareness, social awareness, seeing some social emotional learning in there. Humility, I think is an interesting point. I would, if whoever put that in, if you feel comfortable putting in the chat a little bit about what you mean by that, I'd be interested to hear what you are saying. Well, there's some other skills that we need. If you're having trouble navigating the Mentimeter, you can just put it in the chat as well. Active listening and curiosity, for sure. Find that people are just not super curious about other people's thoughts or how they think. Um, they're curious as so much as they want to like disagree with someone. So we can get one more skill that we need. Some pretty good, I like defiance. We like that. Um, Humility. Thank you, Janelle. Humility meaning that you have to be respectful view of yourself and others' opinions. Yes. Effective communication and active engagement, for sure. And all these seems to be, if we look at that, that's a lot of internal stuff, but it's also a lot about communication. And I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of why classrooms are such a good place because they are places of communication and conversation, and the places where that, we really do a lot of exchange. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go back. All right. Right back here. Right. So I want you to hold on to those skills as we go through this process and we talk about the different ways that you can be using language in your classroom as well as the conflict resolution process. That's going to really bring up some of those social emotional learning skills again, that we get to see. Um, so I was introduced to these ideas more than 20 years ago by my mentor, Gordon Pradle, who was a professor of English education at NYU. In his book, Literature for Democracy, he wrote, "It is not easy to develop democratic competence when existing institutions of schooling are mostly concerned with order and control, with sorting people and keeping them apart." So, as we talk the next hour, I want you to think about your relationship with control in the classroom. Gordon always said that it was the teacher's ability to give up control that not only increased learning engagement, but helped students discover who they were. Gordon passed away a few years ago, so I'm dedicating this webinar to him. So, before we get into specific strategies, I want to step back and talk about how classroom management teaches us anything at all. There's a longstanding idea in education called the hidden curriculum. The concept comes from Philip Jackson's work in the 1960s and refers to the lessons students learn simply by participating in classroom life. Not from what we formally teach, not what's in our lesson plans, but from how school and our classroom actually operates day to day. And it shows up in the small repeated moments. What happens when a student talks out of turn? What happens when someone disagrees? What happens when someone's wrong? What happens when the teacher is wrong? That's a big one, right? And then what happens next? Students are paying close attention to all of this. They notice who gets listened to and who gets shut down. They notice whether explanations are offered or withheld. They notice whether disagreement leads to conversation or to people digging in their heels. They're also learning something very specific about authority from you because in a classroom, the teacher is the most immediate and consistent example of how power works. When I was student teaching, I struggled with classroom management like we all did in our first classrooms. One student who sat in front right by the teacher's desk would give me tips on how to manage the class. And these tips were, about exactly what you think they'd be about, control. And one time she just came out and just said it to me. "You need to control us." That interaction turned into a key moment in my time as an educator. It disturbed me that this young woman expected to be controlled. That was when I made the commitment to myself that I would use classroom management strategies that emphasize responsibility, accountability, and most importantly, agency. Students are watching how we use authority when we're challenged, when we're frustrated, and when we're wrong. They're noticing whether power is something that has to be defended at all costs or something that can explain itself, listen, and still hold firm. If authority shows mainly up as control, students learn that power doesn't need to justify itself and that compliance matters more than understanding. If authority shows up as predictable, explainable, and willing to listen without giving up responsibility, students learn something else, that power and accountability can coexist with voice. Those lessons don't stay in the classroom. We're living in a moment where many adults struggle to disagree without escalating, where people often double down instead of reconsidering, and where false or misleading information can spread faster than careful thinking. That didn't come out of anywhere. That didn't come out of nowhere. Those habits were learned over time. Classrooms are one of the first places young people practice what happens when they're challenged, corrected, or confronted with a different version of events. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about politics or parties here. I'm talking about skills, how people handle disagreements, how they respond to being wrong, how they decide what and who to trust. This is also where classroom management overlaps with the logic behind restorative justice. Instead of asking what rule was broken and what's the punishment, restorative and democratic approaches ask who was affected, what was the impact, and how do we repair the relationship. That shift matters because it teaches students that conflict doesn't mean the conversation is over and that being challenged doesn't automatically make you a victim or a villain. Students are constantly rehearsing roles in our classrooms. That's why classroom management matters so much. It's not just about stopping disruptions. It's about what we're teaching every day, about what it means to live with other people who don't always see the world the same way we do. When classroom management includes explanation, listening, and the path back to the group, the hidden curriculum changes. Students practice staying in the conversation when things are uncomfortable. They practice being wrong without being shamed, and they practice revising their thinking instead of entrenching it. Those are all democratic skills, and they can only be learned through experience, not instruction. So we're going to go back to our Mentimeter, and I'll advance the slide. I asked you in one word, yeah, in one word, describe what students learn about power when it's handled well. Just type the first word that comes to your mind. I'm going to switch over. Mhm. All right, go to the next slide. Here we go. So you should see it up there. And just putting in what is one word, what students learned about power when it's handled well. Thank you, William. You can also put it in the chat like William did. Thank you. They learn trust. Voice. That came up really big. It's a word cloud, so that's why that came up so big. But yes, they learned voice. They learned that their voice matters. And maybe even like they learned to trust their own voice, sort of combining those concepts. They learned compromise. That's a big one. Um, this is a time when people find it really hard to compromise. They find it hard to give something up in order to get something that they want. They feel like giving something up is that they've completely lost. But democracy is all about compromise. Someone told me once that when you're looking to vote for someone, you got to realize that it's public transportation, not a car. Meaning you vote for the person that's going to get you closest to the thing you want, knowing that it's most likely they're never going to get you exactly where you want. Compromise and sort of accepting that is really important. Collaboration, respect. These are all really important skills that it's important for them to learn to experience those things as well as to give them to other people. Let's wait a couple seconds for us to see if there's any more. All right. Thank you all for sharing. Let me flip back. Mhm. I closed all of the windows except for the ones I needed, and somehow it is still too many windows. All right, let me go back to my slides. So in terms of what are the skills that they get? There's no single correct answer. It's students are learning something about power all the time, whether we name it or not. And the way that we learn it most clearly isn't through what we say about power, it's through how we use it in moments of tension. So now let's look at the place where those lessons get taught the fastest in our language in the moment. Specifically, let's talk about four common moments of tension in classroom management. When students talk back, when they refuse to comply, when they're disrupting others, and when they shut down and refuse to work. Not sure if you've ever experienced those four. Um, I have. So imagine this. You're mid-sentence. A student says something sharp back to you, loud enough for others to hear, and they definitely said it loud enough so others would hear. A couple students look up, someone in the back smirks, you hear a laugh, you feel that tight quickening in your chest. Before you say anything, the room is already waiting. And in that pause, everyone is learning something about who's allowed to speak, what happens when you disagree, and how power works in this room. Now, imagine this isn't the first time. This is the third or fourth time this student has talked back this month. Whatever happens next isn't just about today. It's teaching a pattern the class already recognizes. So when a student talks back, many of us respond with something like, "Don't talk to me like that." We've all done it. There's varying versions of that. Um, they're all there. And it's just sort of a gut reaction, right? It just sort of comes up. But what that teaches is that once emotion shows up, conversation's over. Authority doesn't have to listen to you, and it just has to end the interaction, right? And that's what's where sort of where teachers misuse our authority, right? It's just by ending things. And when we end things, that's when the learning stops, obviously. An alternative response might be, "I'm listening, but try that again without the edge." That teaches students that strong feelings don't automatically disqualify you from being heard, but how you express them does matter, and that repair is possible. And I promise you, if you respond this way to a student who is talking back, it'll be such a departure from their past experiences with teachers that they'll be completely disarmed and not know how to respond. I've had that experience a couple of times, and it just sort of like snaps them right out of whatever it is. And it really is just sort of in part because you didn't give the typical teacher response. And then they will be able to talk a little bit more about it. And that's probably because their talking back was also a quick response, right? So we're the adults, they're the kids, they're going to have quick responses. We need to control ours. I found that to be the most difficult part of teaching, but a personal growth area that I really benefited from. Next up, refusing to comply. You give a direction, either line up, open your laptops, get into groups. Most students move, one student doesn't. They stay where they are. No argument, no comment, just stillness. You notice it out of the corner of your eye. A few students notice it too. The flow of the room changes, even though nothing has been said. It's a quiet moment, but it's not neutral. The class is learning something about what happens when instructions aren't followed, how much space resistance takes up, and how authority actually works when no one raises their voice. So when a student refuses to do what they've been asked, the typical move is to escalate. Do it now or there will be consequences. Again, there's a period there, right? That teaches students that power works through force and that compliance matters more than understanding. It also teaches them that if they have a problem, they should keep it to themselves. And we can all see the problem with that, right? Like if students have a problem, particularly with an assignment or something that we're doing that we need to know in order to help them. So instead, you say something like, "I need you to do this. What's making that hard right now?" You're teaching students that expectations are real, they don't get out of them, but so is dialogue. That they're learning that disagreement doesn't have to turn into a standoff. And again, you, the teacher, are the one who determines whether or not this gets into a standoff or not, right? The student is going to do something, or in this case, not do something, right? You are the one who determines whether there's a standoff, whether there's a struggle for power. Um, and my suggestion is, and something I learned was that asking a question is always really great. It just is a good rule of thumb when you see a student, misbehaving, is to ask, "Is everything okay?" Frequently, I learned that everything was not okay, but that I could help the student overcome whatever obstacle they were facing. And that question deepened my relationship with students and avoided those unnecessary power struggles. Um, And also by asking what's making that hard right now, or is everything okay? You might learn actually useful information. You might learn that the student is quietly in pain and physically getting up is difficult, or that they're being bullied by their classmates and they fear getting into the group you just assigned them. Or maybe they're just pissed and they need to release their anger. That happens as well, right? But making it a question, asking them what's hard about doing it, but not excusing them from doing it. That's the balance that you want to have. You're going to do this. I'm here to help you do this. How can I help you? That's the general message that you wanted to share. One of the more difficult ones, when a student is disrupting others. Picture it. You're working in a small group, or you've just started an explanation, and a student nearby keeps pulling attention away. It's not loud enough to stop the class, but it is loud enough to fracture it. There's side comments, like that tapping that some kids do, turning around, trying to get a reaction from a neighbor. A few students try to ignore it, a few engage. The lesson keeps going, but it's thinner now. What's happening isn't just distraction, it's a test of whose learning time is protected and whose isn't. So, whatever you do next teaches students something durable about whose needs matter, about how much disruption is tolerated, and what belonging looks like for everyone else in the room. So, if a student is disrupting a class, it's very common to label them as behavior. You're being disrespectful. That teaches students to see themselves as the problem. And once identity is on the table, repair becomes much harder. And I can guarantee you're about to see a lot more disrespect. All right. Instead, say something like, right now, what you're doing is pulling other people off track. The lesson there shifts. Students aren't learning, Students are learning to think about their impact, not just their intent, and to see themselves as part of a shared community. Like, really, instead of um, berating kids for what they're doing, helping them understand the impact that they're having on other people. And a lot of kids just really, truly don't understand their impact. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the conflict resolution process. But it's a lot of kids just really don't understand how their behavior is impacting other. They've just been told to stop doing it. And we're teachers, so we're there to teach them about why are we asking you to stop doing it. So instead of saying stop doing that, start with naming what it is that they're actually doing and how that's impacting other people. Um, Shutting down. You've asked students to get started. Most do, but one student doesn't pick up a pencil. They stare at the page or past it. The paper is blank. You walk by and quietly repeat the directions. They nod, maybe, but nothing changes. The room keeps moving, but there's a pocket of stillness that feels heavier than noise. Nothing disruptive is happening, and everyone is learning something about what happens when someone disengages, how visible struggle is handled, and whether opting out has consequences or care attached to it. So when students shut down, teachers sometimes respond by disengaging too. Might say something like, well, that's your choice. What that teaches is that belonging is conditional and that opting out ends the relationship, and further, that you don't care. That's the message that it sends. So when you say instead, you don't have to talk right now, but you do need to stay with us, you're teaching that participation has multiple forms and the community still expects you to participate. Again, this theme of we're keeping our expectations high. We're not excusing kids from doing what they're supposed to be doing. We're just approaching how we talk about that in a different way, not accusatory, but with more questions. So when you look back at all four of these scenarios and the democratic way of handling them, you realize that it's also teaching social emotional learning. When students are just asked to follow directions blindly without question, they aren't really learning about themselves or others or how to make responsible decisions. We want to integrate SEL into our instruction, but often forget that embedded methods of teaching SEL, i.e., using real life scenarios to teach what happens nearly every moment in the classroom, is a better way of going. But the democratic approach asks students to think about themselves, to reflect about themselves, think about others and how their actions impact others in the classroom, make decisions that take everyone's needs into account. Good SEL also turns out to be good for our democracy. So before we move on, I want to pause again just briefly. We've been talking about several common moments where your language and how you approach something as a teacher really matters. And these are very difficult. And the reason that they're difficult is because they affect us emotionally, right? And I just told you to not react with like that quick emotional thing. That's where our SEL comes in, but that's a whole other webinar. So rather than talking about them abstractly, I sort of want to ground this in your experience. I'm going to switch us over to Mentimeter in a second again. And on the screen, you're going to see our four moments: talking back, refusing to comply, disrupting others, and shutting down. And you're going to be asked to rate them on two scales. One is pressure, meaning how much stress do you sort of feel in the moment, when something like that happens, and then confidence. How confident are you when something like that happens? All right. So pressure is sort of like how much like how stress does that cause you? And then confidence is, how confident are you that you can handle what to do in the next moment? All right. So I'm going to switch this over. If you can go back to your Mentimeter. All right, it's got some stuff coming in. My Personally, while everyone's sort of doing that, I would share my own personal thing. The thing that always caused me the most stress was when kids talk back. Like, because everything else sort of, you don't necessarily need to, or at least I thought in my head, didn't need to respond right away. But when a kid talks back to you, like publicly, I never sort of in that moment, I'm not good. I'm the kind of person that's always like thinks about the best thing to say, like, later that night. I'm not good in the moment. And so I always found that really, really stressful. Until I learned that I didn't need to necessarily address it right away. That was a huge thing I learned about classroom management, is I didn't always need to address those things. Um, so it looks like people talking back, refusing to comply, those are sort of higher pressure things. But people feel a little bit better about sort of shutting down and disrupting others. I'd love to hear some thoughts in the chat about that. Shutting down is sort of, especially if it's not disrupting others, it is can be a little bit easier to deal with, and you can also deal with it privately, one on one. It's those public things. Well, for me personally, those public things that always sort of got my face red and all flushed. Um, I sort of didn't know how to do it in the moment. Um, so wait a couple of seconds, see if there's any more responses come in. One thing that I think is relevant here that we didn't really haven't talked about yet is what the other major thing I learned in classroom management is whether or not I was being more of a disruption than the students were, and more often than not, I was a bigger just like me telling that kid to stop clicking their pen was way more disruptive than them just clicking the pen. And so I learned very quickly to ask myself the question, by addressing this publicly, am I going to be more of a disruption? And like 9 times out of 10, the answer was yes. And I just had to let it go. And everything was fine. So, these things are really difficult. You can come up with different strategies. You'll learn what works for you. I can give you, all the sort of scripts and everything that, people usually want. But that's not going to match you or your personality. And the thing that kids, especially when they get older, but even younger kids, know when you're not being yourself. They know when you're sort of being fake. And so you really need to find your way of responding to these, thinking about sort of the general concept, the general concepts we're talking about, like how do you listen, how do you ask questions, how do you sort of pause. These are all ways that you have to find the way that works authentically for you. Janelle wrote in the chat, talking back, refusing to comply triggers an emotional response, partly because it's perceived as creating more conflict in the moment. Yeah. Like it's just sort of, then the responses, the vignettes it came up with is, it just feels like the kids are looking at you and you're like, this is just sort of the high pressure thing. And I remember being a younger teacher, it was just, those moments were just the hardest. And can I just teach? That's why we go, and we'll talk about this a little later. That's why we just sort of go into shutdown moments. We just want to teach. I don't want to deal with, this. But we're missing a lot of really great opportunities when we do that. All right. All right. Sorry if I was making you dizzy. All right. So We're going to next talk about conflict resolution. I learned this process from a peace educator I worked with several years ago. It's completely changed how I handle conflict with students, and I try to share it as widely as I possibly can. Because when something works this well, you want everyone to be able to, to use it. This is a module that I'm taking from the free class on the website before the rules, building the relationships that make classroom management work. I decided to include it here because conflict is the fastest way to see how authority, fairness, and expectations actually operate in a classroom. And hopefully, this taste will also entice you to sign up for the free course. There's a bunch of other materials there that you might find useful. So, conflict is natural in any group, especially in classrooms where people bring different needs, experiences, and expectations into the room. When it shows up, it's an opportunity. It is not something to be avoided. To learn something about it's an opportunity to learn something about what a student needs in that moment and what others in the group need in order to learn and feel safe. Working through conflict isn't a break from belonging. It's one of the ways belonging actually gets practiced. When students see that tension and conflict can be addressed without someone being pushed out, that's when you create belonging. I taught in a school that wrote extensive narrative reports on students, particularly their SEL. A frequent positive comment was that the student didn't get into conflicts, and that always bothered me. When confronted with a kid who never got into conflicts, I always wondered, are their needs being met? Students should get into conflict. What we want for them is to be able to get into conflict and be able to handle that well. That should be what our assessment is, not did they get into conflict or not, because they're going to get into conflict, but did they handle it well? Do they engage in the repair conversation? Are they honest about what happened? Are they able to share their feelings? Do they listen to others? These are the things that we should be assessing students on when we're thinking about their conflict resolution skills. Um, Conflict is impossible to avoid, so we have a duty to teach students how to handle it well. Avoiding conflict altogether and rewarding students when there is no conflict is counterproductive. I always worry about the kid who's just, quiet in the corner. Those are sort of, in one way, the teacher's dream in sort of classroom management, but those were always the kids that were hurting the worst. And so, just remember that it's impossible to avoid. So before we move into the process of it, it's important for you to think about your own relationship with conflict. If you are conflict avoidant, you're going to have a difficult time teaching students how to handle conflict well. If you hate seeing people upset with each other, this is a big one, and I know a lot of teachers who are like this, who hate seeing people upset with each other. This is going to be really difficult. It's going to be very uncomfortable for you to sit with, two or more kids who are like really upset with each other. You have to be able to be in a conversation like that. And something I can't help you with during this webinar is how you personally handle conflict, how it makes you feel when you witness it, and how it will impact your work with students. I can maybe do a webinar on that. That's not where my expertise is, but hey, if someone will come, I'll do it. And I know all of this because that was me. I avoided conflict in and out of the classroom at all costs. It was only when I learned myself how to sit with being uncomfortable, to accept that people don't always get along or like each other, that I was able to run conflict resolution sessions correctly. And as with most things in teaching, if you're having trouble, you need to look inward first. So, So to support the kind of language that we've been talking about, I use a simple framework for handling conflicts. I call it the ABC method. It's not a script, it's a structure that helps slow things down and keeps everyone inside the community while conflict gets worked through. I've used it with students as young as 5 and all the way up to adults. Younger students are going to need more of you in the process, but they are just as capable of doing this with support as anyone else is. I've seen it. Younger students need more leading questions, or they need sometimes for you to summarize what they said, because younger kids can sometimes, when they're explaining things, like adults, can sometimes sort of ramble and they lose their train of thought. And so when you're listening to younger kids, you really need to be thinking about what's the story they're telling, and then you have to repeat it back to them in a way that everyone will understand. That's a thing that I had to do a lot when I worked with kindergartners. The kids that age also have impulse control problems, so this is a great opportunity to practice sitting back. We'll get to that part. Older students are able to handle much more difficult topics, but then you're sort of fighting hormones and emotions and everything that is being a teenager. Your life just sucks because you're a teenager, and that makes it hard. So again, just sort of engage in this process. I have used it. It really, really works. I promise. And I almost always hesitate to give structures like this because people sometimes get like too prescriptive with them. But this process is sort of very simple by design. And again, this is not my process. I didn't create this. I call it the ABC conflict resolution. I didn't do it, but someone else did. Whoever did it is a genius. A stands for ask. When there's a conflict, the first thing to do is ask each person involved, plus any witnesses, what happened. One at a time, everyone gets a turn to speak without interruption. If someone tries to jump in while someone else is talking, you have to pause and say, "You'll get your turn. Right now, we're just listening." This is where you need to be the most, right? Just sort of, this is the hardest part for a lot of kids. As students talk, I listen for where each person starts their story. In my experience, most students begin at the moment where they see themselves as the victim. It's not a problem, it's just information. And if you listen to kids tell stories about where things went wrong or what their view of a conflict was, you'll start to see that they always start where they're the victim. And there's usually about 5 to 10 minutes before that, or maybe like a whole day before that. And so that's usually a question I'll ask is, well, what happened? What was going on right before this? Because that's usually very illuminating. Um, and so you give one person the time uninterrupted to talk, and then you give the other person uninterrupted time to talk, and you just sort of go back and forth. And I like this sort of conversation because they get to respond to each other. Because when they do interrupt, it's because they want to they want to respond. They feel like something's not fair or whatever, and that's fine. They should. And so we sort of go back and forth, and everyone sort of goes until they feel like they've said their piece or they don't really have anything additional to say. Um, and what I have found out, and I don't have numbers on this, but I'm pretty sure it's true, is that almost every single time I've done this, the conflict resolved themselves right here. Right. Once students hear how the same situation looked from someone else's point of view, things start to shift. A lot of big conflicts turn out just to be misunderstandings that escalated because no one slowed down enough to listen to them. I can't tell you how many times the conversation ended with both parties, having to hearing each other and just being like, "Oh my God, I didn't realize. I'm so sorry." And they're like, "I'm sorry too." And then just everything just sort of falls into place, right? Even the youngest kids. And it just really goes to show you that it's conflict conflict resolution. Good conflict resolution is about seeing things from other people's perspective, and that's also good SEL, and that's also good for our democracy. And so those skills, even if the conflict gets resolved quickly, right? Those skills of listening, holding back, and waiting are extremely important to our democracy. And I'm sure you saw it at Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday dinner you had, or just on the internet, really wherever you are right now, people are just ready to jump right in, right? And so we need to sort of slow down. Um, if someone does try to jump in or argue, I pause and say, "Okay, you'll get your turn, but right now you're just listening." And as students talk, I listen for where each person starts their story. Oh, I did this part. Sorry. So, all right. All right. So, if you do have to sort of get past this point, if the conflict doesn't resolve itself through the conversation, um, you go on to the next step. B stands for brainstorm. And once everyone's story is on the table, we shift from what happened to what could repair the situation. I'll ask, what could make this right, or what needs to happen so we can move forward? The solution needs to work for everyone, but it doesn't mean everyone gets everything they want. That's where, we talked about compromise earlier. This is where kids learn compromise, right? You can't get everything you want. You're in a conflict, you're going to have to give something up, right? And this is a huge thing to learn. And if I've been listening closely as the person sort of facilitating this, I might reflect back what I heard mattered most. Or I might say something like, "It sounds like respect was really important to you," or "It seems like you were worried about what other people thought." Um, I always leave room to be wrong, and say, "Well, tell me if I'm missing something." So use a piece of paper to track the brainstorm. Remember that brainstorms aren't about judgment. They're about getting ideas out so you can evaluate them later. And I've hammered that point home by asking them first to give me the silliest or most ineffective ways of solving the problem. And the most ineffective ways is usually like the most fun one. That not only gets the point across that what we're doing here is just to get ideas out, but also you can, kind of make them laugh and, just sort of any kind of levity you might be able to bring, or just to make them smile a little bit, can make these things a little bit better. So you just sort of brainstorm. Again, no evaluation. Try to get all the ideas out, and have them be continue to think about, what do I need, and what can I do without. And C stands for commit. So once we've brainstormed a few options, we look at the list together and narrow it down. I'll ask which of these feels like something you can actually do, which feels fair to everyone. When we land on something everyone agrees on, make it explicit. I ask each person to say out loud what they're committing to. That commitment might be simple, like I won't participate in gossip, or I'll stop bringing this up in group chats. Saying it loud matters. It turns the agreement from an idea into a responsibility. And one last thing I want to name, especially for those of you who work with younger students, after students make a commitment, a lot of them expect everything to just immediately feel better. They think, okay, I said I'm sorry, or I'll agree to stop, and now the conflict is over. Why are they still mad at me? I've had this conversation with a lot of 5-year-olds. That's not how feelings work, though, right? So even when a conflict is resolved, hurt feelings linger. That doesn't mean the process failed. It doesn't mean that the agreement wasn't real. It doesn't mean the relationship is broken forever. That's not when you work with kindergartners. You spend a lot of time like trying to get them to understand that just because you were upset with a friend doesn't mean you're no longer friends. I'll sometimes say to students, "You did the right thing. Now just give it time." Learning that feelings fade gradually and that you can keep showing up respectfully while they fade is an important part of growing up. Follow up to conflict resolution conversations is important. I usually check in with each person individually later that day or as soon as possible the next day. I ask them what they thought about what the other person said, as well as the commitment they made. I take this as an excellent opportunity to coach students on SEL skills. If they made a commitment to not gossip, just turning them loose without any support is going to wind up in failure. In the post-conversation coaching session, I might ask the student to talk about how they might avoid gossip. What would they do or say the next time they are in a group and someone gossips? Again, this is if you're having a lot of conflict in your classroom, a lot of kids, you may not have time to do all this coaching. I'm talking about sort of, ideal situations of what you would want to do. So again, I think this is an ideal situation. I know it's not always possible to do these sort of in-depth individual coaching sessions. And you don't necessarily need to even do them with everyone who was involved in the conflict. You could just do it with one of them who, really needs your support. A lot of time goes into doing conflict resolution correctly, and you can have a great conversation and make great commitments. But if the participants don't have the skills to enact their commitments, the conflict is just going to show up again. All right. All right, so our Q&A is next. So please take a minute to ask a question in our Q&A box. Before we get to that, while you're putting in your questions, the conflict resolution module comes partly from the free course Before the Rules, as I said, where you'll also learn a useful framework along with tools and strategies for building relationships with your students, as well as advice on setting up routines that don't feel boring. There is also practice in dealing with difficult situations, a reflection on your current routines, and a final project that asks you to focus on one student with whom you are having a difficult time and write a plan to improve your relationship. I wanted to show you that course plus other courses on Pedagogy Guru. because the site and this work grows out of a pretty simple problem. That a lot of professional development doesn't give teachers the time or space to really think. It treats teachers' expertise as unimportant and offers quick solutions that are just really divorced from the classroom. When I was a teacher and I used to sit in these, I used to call them teaching for dummies. And I'd always leave thinking, if you didn't think that I already knew this, why are you letting me in front of students? When I'm doing this, I I called it professional development for expert teachers because I think that every teacher is an expert, should be treated like they're an expert, and shouldn't be talked down to. So it's built to support classrooms of belonging by giving teachers ways to engage with ideas on their own time. It's all asynchronous, at their own pace in the context of their own classrooms. And this last page I'll show you from the side, shows how the thinking gets organized into courses. Each course takes one part of classroom life and slows it down. We have the classroom management course, a course on reading choice, and one course on reflection. And they're intentionally short and focused. Each course has a research study as a grounding reading, but we don't wallow in theory. We get right down to how these theories and ideas get enacted in your classroom. There are assignments and projects that ask you to think about your actual classroom, your current assignments, current students, current routines, and revise them. And some sessions utilize games and simulations for real-time practice. And I had a lot of fun coming up with those games. I hope you check out the courses. Before the Rules is free, so you've got nothing to lose. There's a whole bunch of additional resources on classroom management that we don't have time to talk about here. All right, question and answer. Let's see if anyone had any questions. No open questions. I did an incredible job. Thank you. I'll vamp a little bit more just to see if anyone wants to put in a last question. All right. If you go, hold on. Sorry, I'll come back to that. All right, so, oops. I'd like to end with another quote from Gordon, since this was dedicated to him. Let me move a window. Teaching involves staying with the mess that is democracy rather than being seduced by the inefficiencies, or I'm sorry, seduced by the efficiencies of unquestioned authority. And I'm struck by his use of the word efficiencies here. Doing what we've talked about in the past hour just really is not easy. In fact, it's terribly difficult. And it's much easier to just say, I'm in charge, do it or else. And we've had those moments. Even the most like democratic teacher sometimes it's just like, can you just do it, please? Um, but in doing so, we fail our students, and I think we can see more widely our society. Many people are asking what's next after our current political reality comes to an end. Fingers crossed that it does. What's next is going to depend on the generation currently sitting in our classrooms. They'll be the ones who march us further down the path to authoritarianism, or the ones who reinvigorate our democracy. And we have a chance to impact that generation now. So I hope that you will stay with the mess. On March 2nd, I'm going to have another webinar for SEL Day. It's going to be on improving students' self-awareness by teaching reflection skills. I just came up with that idea today, so I don't have any like registration page for you to open, but I will send that out. And just to remind you, all of the resources from the webinar are on that web page. I'm going to share that link again in the chat. And if you go there, that second link there is the evaluation. I would really, really appreciate taking it's just 5 questions, 3 multiple choice, and 2 open-ended questions. I would really, really love to hear from you and to hear any thoughts you have on the session. The link to the recording will be added to that page, and I'll send out an email to let you know that's happened. And if you want to reach out to me, the contact information is on the webpage, but is also here in the chat. So if you do come up with questions, please feel free to email me. I love to help people out and talk about these things. Thank you all for coming.